Welcome, everybody. Been following a few of these Naturalist Hour talks, and it's been kind of fun to see a bunch of my colleagues and other naturalists in the area talking about what they're passionate about. So I'm hoping I can introduce you to this world that I live in on a daily basis. And before I start, I just want to emphasize that every picture that you see in this talk, and there are a lot of pictures, is of a species of insect that can be found locally right around here in the DC area. So there's no reason you can't find any of these things if you're looking in the right place and at the right time. So I just want to preface my talk with that. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do today in this next hour is first tell you a little about what caterpillars are. So I'm going to go over a little bit of basic biology of the caterpillars. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about their intimate relationships with their host plants. So one of the tricky things about studying caterpillars is that you have to know some botany as well. So, and I know a lot of you do, so that'll be helpful. Then I'll talk a little bit about strategies for finding caterpillars in the field. This is a task that anybody can do, especially kids are really good at it. And then talk a little bit about rearing caterpillars at home. So how, if you're interested in doing it, or if your kids are, or friends of yours are, then what's the best way to go about it? I have lots of experience to share. And then a lot of the talk, I'm going to be going over some of just a select few of common local caterpillars that you may come across. And these are all species that are pretty common around here and that you may have seen before, or maybe they're new to you. And I'll talk a little bit about them and their biology. And then I'll end with a little plug for my and Diane's interest in using caterpillars in the classroom as a STEM learning tool, which we've been doing for many, many years, kind of in a nice partnership with A&S. And then I'll end with some resources for identification for those of you who want further information, and there's lots. Okay, so I think the best place to start is where we start with the kids, which is the basic life cycle of what we refer to as holometabolous insects, so insects that have complete metamorphosis. And here we're talking about an order of moths, the Lepidoptera, which includes moths and butterflies, both together. And just so you know, this order, it's one of the big 4 orders of insects, and insects are the largest group of animals on the planet. But just in this order alone, there's over 180,000 described species worldwide. And although butterflies get a lot of attention, it turns out there's way more moth species than there are butterflies, at least 10 times as many moths as there are butterflies. And a typical life cycle for a moth or a butterfly has 4 distinct life stages, right? So they begin life as an egg. After a little while, the egg hatches, and a small, what we call a neonate or a first instar caterpillar chews its way out of the eggshell and immediately usually commences feeding on plants. And so that's referred to as the larval stage. Then when that's completed, it moves on to the pupal stage, which is a really interesting phase. And I depicted a couple different pupae here. So one is a monarch butterfly, which is part of this cartoon. And that is referred to, butterflies have a special name for these sculptured naked pupae. They refer to them as a chrysalis. But for most moths, they sort of come in 2 flavors, which you can see to the right. They're either a naked pupa, much like the chrysalis, and we just call it a pupa or puparium. And then sometimes that pupa is enclosed within a cocoon. So the one right to the far right is a cocoon, is a pupa inside of its cocoon. And then of course the adult butterfly or moth emerges from that stage. So those are the 4 basic stages. And of course, all of today, I'm going to be focusing on only one of those stages, right? We're just going to be talking about the caterpillar stage or the larval stage, which we're going to refer to specifically for Lepidoptera. We have a special name for the larval stage and we call them caterpillars, right? So that's how caterpillars relate to the rest of insects. Okay, so now I'm going to spend a little time about introducing this organism and what its motivation is. So one of the cool things about holometabolous insects is they've split up different tasks among the different life stages. And clearly, there's some special jobs that the larval stage is adapted to do very well. And so the first job that a caterpillar has is to eat, and that is the main job, right? So caterpillars consume many times their body weight in plant tissue during their lifetime. So you can see this picture. I just took this 2 days ago. This is on hickory, and this is one of our beautiful I'm trying to remember the name of that one. It'll come to me in a second. But Daytona, sorry, caterpillars that's feeding on hickory. And then, of course, because they eat, just like the child's book, they must poop as well, right? And so we often see with caterpillars, one of the ways we often find them is we see their excrement. And it's this dry little pellets that we have a special name for them. We call them frass. And so frass is a unique term we refer to specifically for caterpillars. And they do interesting things with it. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then, of course, the reason they're eating so much is because they need to grow. And so caterpillars increase their body mass by more than 1,000 times during their larval stage. So the analogy from the newly hatched caterpillar, from the egg to the last instar that's about to pupate, that would be the equivalent of a human being growing to the size of an elephant in terms of how much they increase in their body mass. So, but in order to get bigger, of course, like all arthropods, which they are, they need to shed their skin or their exoskeleton, which is referred to as a cuticle in the caterpillars. And each time they do so, that's referred to as a molt, right? So they have to shed their whole skin. And the only hard part really on a caterpillar is their head capsule. As you can see here in this skipper caterpillar, they got this chitin head capsule, and that is a hard thing, and it can't get any bigger. So in order for the caterpillar to grow, it needs to pop off its head capsule and grow a new one each time it molts. And the stages in between the molts are referred to as instars, right? So on this little cartoon, if you count them going from smallest to largest, you can see there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 instars in this particular species here that's depicted, right? And so the instars are the stages between the molts, okay? And just to give you a nice idea of the difference between a first instar and a last instar of this particular species, I don't think you noticed this, but there's a first instar riding shotgun on the back of this last instar silver-spotted skipper caterpillar. So you can get an idea of the difference in size. And it's only within a matter of a few weeks of basically nonstop feeding that they go from that size, from the small size to the large size. So they're well adapted to do that. And then as they prepare to enter the next phase, which is the pupal phase, caterpillars do some really weird things. So you can see this skipper, this is a fifth instar and then the last instar, and it stops feeding and starts acting strangely, and oftentimes changes its behavior pretty dramatically as it seeks out a location in which to form go to the next stage or to pupate. And so we refer to these late instar caterpillars that have stopped feeding as pre-pupae. And the weird thing is they often change color. So and very typically they change to some kind of pink. So that's pretty typical for a lot of different species. Why they're pink, I don't really know, but it's kind of, it tells you that they're going on to the next stage. Okay, and then the last part of a caterpillar's job, besides eating, pooping, and growing, is they need to survive, right? And caterpillars are really important prey items for both invertebrates as well as vertebrates, like the bluebird depicted here eating a caterpillar. It's actually feeding it to its young. So they're under constant pressure from natural enemies. And so natural selection then has sort of molded their morphology, their behavior, their coloration, all these kinds of things in order to minimize the chance that they're going to get detected and eaten by a predator. And so there's a couple different ways in which they avoid being eaten. So a lot of caterpillars are cryptic, so we refer to this as crypsis. Some use some kind of camouflage, and others are what we refer to as mimetic, where they look like inanimate objects in order to avoid detection. I'm going to show you some examples of each of these. So here we have a little lima-coated slug caterpillar on this beech leaf. And I took this picture because I was trying to get the caterpillar, and inadvertently I took a picture of the most common pathogen, a little fungus, Saronella, that grows on beech very commonly. And this fungus on the leaf forms a little yellow ring of chlorosis around the fungal pathogen in order to kind of protect the plant a little bit. And if you notice on that caterpillar, it has that same exact sort of ring around the same color as the pathogen. So, you can see how it easily would blend in with the leaf if you're looking at it from below. And then here's a Synchlora errata. This is a little inchworm caterpillar that feeds on flowers. And what it does is it actually picks bits of the flowers that it's feeding on and adorns its back with the pieces of flowers in order to blend in really well with their host plant. So there's a camouflage. And here's a good example of mimesis. So this inchworm caterpillar you can see here is both being a morphological mimetic as well as a behavioral mimetic, in that it's clasping onto the branch of its host plant and it's not moving at all. So it's just held this erect posture off of the stem, just presenting itself to the world like I'm a stick, right? And works really well. And a lot of times it fools us. Unless you touch it, then you're like, something feels weird when you touch it because it looks just like a twig. And there's a lot of geometrids that do that. And then finally, you have to look close on this picture, but there's a very large prominent moth caterpillar, Oligocentria lignicolor, one of our prominent moth caterpillars. And you can see it sort of bent around that oak leaf. And you can see the patterning in its body blends in almost amazingly with the damaged leaf. So these are all examples of ways in which caterpillars avoid detection. Okay. So another way you can survive is to hide. So rather than be camouflaged, you can just hide altogether, right? So lots of caterpillars build and inhabit shelters on their host plants in order to avoid interactions with natural enemies. So this is an example of a leaf tie on this white oak plant here, where you can see there's the damaged part is because the two leaves are silked together, and there's several caterpillars feeding in this little shelter that they've built. Other caterpillars roll the leaves into, you've probably seen these, especially in the spring when the leaves are really soft. We see a lot of leaf rolls on all the broadleaf tree species around here. And you can see they use silk to do this, right? So the caterpillars have special silk glands, and they can build these constructs and inhabit them that afford them some protection from their natural enemies. And others go to even further extremes. So they spend their whole life feeding internally. So here we have a stem boring caterpillar, and there's lots of caterpillars that do this. And they often have a little hole. You can see this is on Robinia, on black locust, and you can see there's a little hole at the top. And that's where the caterpillar will dump its frass, because otherwise their whole house would become accumulated with frass. And so there's lots of these species, and they're pretty well protected because you'd have to somehow open up the branch in order to find that particular caterpillar. So hiding is a good strategy. And then there's those that defend. So those that have morphology behavior in order to protect themselves against natural enemies that they do encounter. So this beautiful spun glass slug you can see here has this elaborate sort of array of tubercles that's coming off of it. And all of those are deciduous, which means that they can be removed without harming the insect. So if an animal comes along and bites into it, they get a big mouthful of those spines, and they pull right off the insect and don't even harm it. It's kind of like a lizard's tail. Close in the same family, we have the saddleback caterpillars, and just by looking at them, you can get a good idea, right, that these insects are very well defended. In this case, they're chemically defended. So they have these prickly spines that contain venom, so they break off when insects rub against them. So if you've ever been stung by one of these, you will remember it. I've been stung many times. And there are lots of caterpillars that use seedy, which is this fancy name for hairs, and all kinds of different arrangements. on their bodies that make themselves unpalatable, particularly to birds, because birds are big predators of a lot of caterpillars, and a lot of birds don't like to eat hairy caterpillars for good reason, right? So by surrounding themselves with these sort of urticating hairs, it doesn't taste very good. So like kind of like this eastern tent caterpillar here. And then there are all kinds of interesting behavioral things that happen. So lots of caterpillars feed gregariously. So that means they feed in a big group. And this group of Daytona is actually displaying. So when we came along and kind of touched one of them, they all started waving their heads back and forth on the branch in concert to try to make a big visual display that can you imagine could be a little disconcerting for a predator that happened upon them. So defending yourself is another way to go. And I didn't have a picture of this, but another thing a lot of caterpillars do, and if you handle them at all, you'll notice this, when they feel threatened, one of the common things that they do is they regurgitate. So they'll barf up whatever's in their gut contents in a big blob. And that works really well against things like ants and parasitic wasps that try to attack them. Okay, so to show another behavior, I'm going to show a little video here. Let's see if this is working. So this is a really common tiger swallowtail. And when they get bothered by a predator, like pretending this finger is a predator, they have these specialized structure called osmeteria that have a really foul smell, and they evert them. And you can see these caterpillars already kind of a snake mimic, and so that almost looks like a snake's tongue. It's one of the many people's interpretation. But it also has a really foul smell, has some chemical irritants associated with it. Okay. So I'm going to go to the next one. And I have one more video that shows some of the morphological combined with behavior that caterpillars have. So a lot of things, especially parasitic wasps, often try to attack caterpillars and paralyze them or lay eggs in them. And so some caterpillars have evolved these strange adaptations where they've taken the sort of primitive legs that they have on their abdomen and elongated them into these sort of whip tails. And so this furcula caterpillar does this, and you'll see it very clearly in the video. So imagine if you're trying to get on its back, it's got this sort of built-in structures that it uses to knock off any other arthropod predators that are trying to get to it. So it wriggles about. I love these guys. We call these the whiptails. Okay. Okay, so before I go any further, I think it's important to just show a little bit of anatomy. Anatomy is always important because if you want to identify caterpillars, they'll refer to different parts of them. So the main thing is I want to emphasize that even though this is the larval stage, an immature stage of the insect, it still has all the same body parts of every other insect, right? And if you recall, insects have three main body parts. They have a head, here in blue. They have a thorax, here. And then they have an abdomen, which is A1 through A10. So there's 10 segments in the abdomen. So those are the three body parts. And the way you can tell the thorax, right, is because the true legs that become the 6 legs of all insects are located on each of the 3 segments of the thorax. So T1, T2, and T3. Then what's weird, and you can see those look jointed legs. That's what arthropods are, right? They have these jointed legs on the true legs. But what's weird about caterpillars compared to lots of other insect larvae is they've evolved these fleshy appendages that act like legs that really aren't legs, that are called prolegs. And the location and arrangement of the prolegs is one of the diagnostic tools we use to tell the different families of moths and butterflies apart. So you can see this generic one has a set of prolegs, and there's one on either side. I'm just showing one side of it, so they're in pairs. So there's one on the 3rd abdominal segment, the 4th, the 5th, the 6th. Then there's nothing on the 7th, 8th, and 9th. And then at the 10th, there's this anal proleg, and that's pretty typical of a lot of caterpillars. If we look at the head, there's little primitive antennae just subtending the sort of head, and there are these little eye spots called stomata. They don't have really good eyes, but they have these sort of areas that sense light and dark that are on their head capsule, and then their mouth parts, their labrum, and their mandibles are down here. What's also interesting about the prolegs is that if this is one of the prolegs seen from the underneath side, there are these little hooks, and those hooks are called crochets. And if you've ever held a really big caterpillar and the way they grip onto your hand before, what you're feeling is these little hooks, these crochets grabbing onto you as they maneuver themselves around, and they can be really strong. But the arrangement of the crochets is actually, again, one of the diagnostic characters they use for caterpillars. And then the last thing I want to point out, it's not very clear on this drawing, but I'm going to show you a real caterpillar in just a second, are these little holes on each of the abdominal and sometimes the thoracic segments called spiracles. And those little holes are what they breathe through. So the breathing tubes are the tracheae come off of these spiracles. So they do gas exchange, both taking in oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide through the spiracles. Okay, that's our anatomy lesson for the day. And this is much more fun to look at a real caterpillar. So here's an imperial moth, a young imperial moth. And you can see here's the head. Here's the 3 thoracic segments that have the true pairs of legs. And then this is the first abdominal segment. So this is A1 with its spiracle, and A2, A3. And then we see our first prolegs, A4, A5, A6, just like I showed in the picture. And then the last set at the end, right? And that contrasts very differently with this inchworm, right? Which you guys all know as inchworms, which are larvae in the family Geometridae, or the geometer moth caterpillars. And again, here's the head. Oops, I lost my arrow. Here's the head. Here's the 3 thoracic segments with the real legs. And then there aren't any prolegs until we get to the 8th abdominal segment. So we skipped 3, 4, 5, and 6 altogether. There's no prolegs. But on 8, there's a pair. And then 10, there's a pair. And so the way the caterpillar moves require that there be no legs in the middle, because they move the front, then they move the back, then they move the front, then they move the back. And that's how inchworms move, locomote on their plants. Okay. So a little bit about their relationship with their host plants, which I think is really important. So most caterpillar feed on plants. Most of them the vast majority are herbivores. A few of them also feed on lichens, algae, or fungi. There's a couple in Hawaii that are predators, but that's very unusual. And really all plants are up for grabs. They can consume leaves, stems, flowers, fruits, seeds, even roots. So there are caterpillars that feed on virtually every part of the plant that has been described. And of course, many farmers and gardeners know a lot about caterpillars because they're crop and forest pests. So they're major pests, and they do a lot of damage and decrease yields of crops. So things like the soybean looper, which is depicted here, the tobacco hornworm, which is the bane of your existence if you're growing tomatoes. Here's a corn earworm, gypsy moths, spruce budworms in forests. You guys have probably all heard about emerald ash borers. That's actually a beetle. So there's beetles that do this as well. But lots and lots of Lepidoptera feed upon crops and trees. Okay, so one thing about their relationships with their host plants and why this is such an important part of the equation is because the vast majority of caterpillars have relatively specialized diets. There's a few that are really generalists and can feed on almost anything, and I'll mention a few of those, but most of them are pretty constrained in what they feed on. So if you want to look for a certain caterpillar, you need to go look for the plant that it's found on, that it's associated with. So this is a tricky test because you have to be able to recognize both the insect and the plant, so which makes it interesting and challenging. And so there are a few that are really specialized. So you probably all know your milkweeds, which already bloom or are blooming or have already bloomed. Mine are fruiting right now. And milkweeds have a bunch of specialized insects, one of them being the monarch butterfly caterpillars that feed upon them. Catalpa, one of our common understory trees here, and a Catalpa sphinx, the one that Diane started off our talk by showing you an example of. This one's a darker one, but it's the same caterpillar species. And then if you're lucky enough to grow pipevine, Aristolochia, which is another native plant, there are pipevine swallowtails that are found on this as well, right? So these are really specialized. They're only found on these individual specific host plant species. And the reason they have this relationship, of course, is because of chemistry, right? So chemistry is hugely important in these relationships. And so with monarchs, of course, what they're doing is the plants are highly toxic and defended with these cardiac glycosides that the caterpillars have evolved, not only the ability to counteract so they can detoxify them, but they can also sequester these compounds for their own defense. The same with the Catalpa sphinx that have iridoid glycosides, and the pipe vines that have aristolochic acids that are in their host plants. So these are all toxic plants with caterpillars that they themselves are toxic and are also advertising their toxicity by being very brightly colored. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about finding caterpillars in the field. So if you want to find them, where do you go to and how do you do it? And so my preferred method is to just look, right? So you inspect foliage on interesting host plants by looking carefully on both the top and the bottom of individual leaves, or you can turn over whole branches if they're flexible enough. And you want to look for fresh leaf damage, or if you're lucky enough to see frass pellets that have fallen on a leaf or on the ground, then look up and right above it and see what you see that might be feeding. Another way to find lots of caterpillars is to look for the constructs, the things that they build. And lots of caterpillars do this. So all kinds of leaf shelters, so leaf ties and rolls and tents of all kinds, webs with lots of silk. That's a sure sign that you're going to find some caterpillars. You might also want to inspect the stem and bark for caterpillars because they hide out there quite often. The latest trend in caterpillar searching is to use ultraviolet flashlights. They make these special UV lights. And it turns out that a lot of caterpillars have patterning that cause them to fluoresce in the ultraviolet range. And so people are finding all the kinds of things at night. And a lot of caterpillars feed at night in order to avoid detection by birds during the day. So that can be really productive as well. Another way you can do that, and here I am working several years ago with some volunteers or families with the Friends of Sligo Creek, where we were using a beading technique where you put a sheet out or some kind of tarp, and then you gently with a stick, you kind of bang against the woody part of the branch to dislodge caterpillars that are feeding on the vegetation, and they fall, and then you just inspect the sheet below. And a lot of people like to use that strategy as well. But for any of your searching, I want to issue my little warning that people react differently to handling caterpillars. So there are many hairy and spiny caterpillars, some of which sting, and some of which just cause allergic reactions in certain people. Some people are sensitive and some people are not. So it's always a good idea to be careful in handling caterpillars with your bare hands. You want to just basically pick them on the foliage that they're feeding on instead of handling them directly. That's usually the best thing. And then put them in a Ziploc bag or a container or something like that. And just be careful. And you can read about them to find out how, whether or not they sting. Okay, so a little bit about caterpillar rearing, a fun activity for people of all ages. So my general rule of thumb is I tell kids only collect caterpillars that you find on a plant. If you find them crossing the road or on the sidewalk or on your porch or something, then you don't know necessarily what they were eating. So if you collect them and just throw some grass or some leaves in a container, odds are that's not what they were feeding on and they're going to starve to death, and that's not very humane. So really, I would recommend you only collect them if you find them on the plant, because once you found them on the plant, you know it is what it is they're eating, right? And so then you want to make a record, record the host plant that you found it on and make notes of where it might be located, because like I said before, they eat a lot. And so you need to go back and get some leaves from that plant or one like it in order to continue to allow them to develop in captivity. I like to rear them in these clear plastic deli containers that you just buy. You can get them at a deli or you can just buy them yourself. The clear are great because you can see what's happening in the container before you open it up. So especially when the pupae are emerging and there are butterflies or moths flying around, you want to be able to see that before you open it up and let them out. So, but in order to rear them, what you want to do is just put a little piece of moist paper towel or a little piece of filter paper, something that you make moist but not too wet, and that'll maintain humidity inside the container. The thing you don't want to do that kids always want to do is poke holes in the container, and that just dries out everything, including the host plant. There's plenty of oxygen in a typical container. You don't need to worry about poking holes. Then, of course, you want to change leaves every few days and empty out the frass. I encourage people to take pictures regularly of the different stages. When they get close to finishing, you're going to want to give them a little bit of, some people use soil. I like to use peat moss, which you can just buy at the hardware store. It's acidic and it prevents fungi, which is can often attack caterpillars and pupae. So peat moss works really, really well. And then for those caterpillars that need a place to burrow into something dark to pupate, they'll go down into the peat moss and form their puparium there. When you're rearing the caterpillars, you don't want to put them in the sun. You can roast the caterpillars in their containers very easily. I've made this mistake myself. So you can see my shelf in my lab is some distance away from the windows. So you want to get some indirect light, but not direct light so that you fry them. And then finally, if your caterpillars get through to the pupae stage and don't emerge during the summer and it becomes fall or it's starting to get cold out, what you want to do is keep them in their peat moss in their container and just move them outside in some kind of protected location. So a shed or a mulch pile, someplace where you remember where they are and they're going to be kind of a little bit protected from the elements, but still will get the regular temperatures of being outside. That will be perfect. Okay. So now I'm going to move on to talk about some common local caterpillars. So I'm going to, the same format I'm going to use for every one of these species. So I'll show you the common name, the scientific name, what host plants they feed on, and when they're to be found. So I'm going to start with the earliest caterpillar that most people see in this early spring with the Eastern tent caterpillar. It's kind of iconic. I always look forward to seeing them every year. It feeds on cherry pretty exclusively and close relatives, some of the cultivated cherries as well as crabapple. And they form these very obvious silken tents where they're central place foragers. So the caterpillars will hang out here and then they'll send out foragers that will eat the vegetation some distance away and then they come back in. So there's big groups of caterpillars that are essentially foraging on a regular basis. And they can do a lot of damage, but they are natural, they're native species. They usually don't kill the trees, they just damage them. The trees respond by putting out new leaves and so on and so forth. Another common local caterpillar is the gypsy moth, and this is one of the only the only non-native one I'm going to show today, but it's also a spring feeder. It's very common in the early spring and can be very damaging, but it's also a beautiful caterpillar. It's got these blue and red spots and interesting hairs, a little mask on its face, and it prefers oaks, but it will feed on poplar and willow, a few others, and it's a common caterpillar of spring. Another common spring caterpillar, perhaps abundance-wise, maybe the most common, is the fall cankerworm. And these are geometrids, so the ones that move like inchworms. The scientific name is Alsophila pomateria. And they're really common on maples and on elms, oaks, willows, a whole lot of deciduous trees. They're pretty generalized. They come in two different color morphs, so you often see green and dark patterned ones that have different stripes down their back. But the way you can always tell you have a fall cankerworm is if you look at the proleg. So again, here's the head, here's the 3 regular legs. Geometrids are supposed to have a pair on A8 and A10, but there's this little nubbin that's like half a pair that's on the 7th abdominal segment. And really the only common geo that has that is this fall cankerworm. So I always look for that, and then I know I got one. They're really weird because in some places they're parthenogenetic, which means the females don't need to mate at all, so they just give birth to clones. And the females of fall cankerworms are wingless. So this is a wingless moth that never flies. Looks very strange, and they're a bunch like that. Okay, perhaps the most common one that's posted on one of these identification sites that people always post pictures of when they see it is the white-marked tussock moth caterpillar, Orgia leucostigma. It's really beautiful. It's got these white tussocks down its back, an orange head, these big black hair pencils that protrude from the front of its body, and then all these colorful bristles on the back. I never get stung by this one, but some people say that it can irritate them. But it's really beautiful, super common, and this one just molted. So you can see its old molt is right here, and here's the later instar. And it's a common feeder. It likes willows and a lot. You can find it on cherry and oaks and hickories and several other ones, and it's found throughout the summer. There's a couple generations of that species. Okay, this one probably everybody's familiar with. So people often just refer to these as woolly worms or woolly bear caterpillars. They're really common. Unlike most of the species I've shown so far, these ones are more common to be found low to the ground. So they don't typically feed on woody, although they feed on a couple different woody plants. They mostly feed on herbaceous plants, that kind of weeds that you find in your yard. So I find them in my backyard often. They feed on plantago, plantain, dandelion, lamb's quarters, all kinds of violets, the leaves, etc. And these are the banded woolly bears, the ones that people always have superstitions about. You can tell the weather by, you know, how wide the bands are, or something kind of crazy like that, which is not true, but it's a nice story. And they run around feeding a little bit on this and a little bit on that. And they turn into tiger moths, really beautiful moths as well. And you can find them through the summer. And then in the fall, something really interesting happens. All these caterpillars in the last instar are looking for a place to hang out and hibernate as caterpillars. So they overwinter as caterpillars in some kind of sheltered location. And a lot of times you'll find them by hordes crossing roads in rural sites where you'll see 10 or 15 just in one stretch of the road, all on some mission. And they're just crossing the road looking for a place to pupate. So it's kind of cool that you can find these guys kind of migrating in the fall. Okay, another super common oak feeding caterpillar that I see very commonly around here, and it is out right now, are the yellow lined prominent. So I have an early instar, a mid instar, and a late instar of this one. They've got these yellow lines down their back, just like you might expect. They have sort of a seafoam green head capsule, kind of large head. It's really beautiful. And then they have, when the later instars, you can see they have these red spiracles. So the spiracles themselves on the outside are colored with this red. And they have these bright yellow and black mandibles, which is really distinctive as well. You can see this one kind of hiding out, looking like a little snake there. And they're predominantly oak feeders. So I like this one a lot. Then another very common one that people always ask for identifications are and misidentify is a very common native species known as the fall webworm, which I've done a bunch of research on myself, Hyphantria cunea. And these are the ones, unlike the tent caterpillars, which are in the spring, these guys are in the summer and into the fall. They have 2 generations locally, so they're out right now, and the fall generation is going to be starting soon. And they're very different from the tent caterpillars because they make a web like the tent caterpillars, but they web the ends of branches as opposed to webbing the trunk, which is where the tent caterpillars are. So when you see these very large webs that encompass a whole branch, you have fall webworms for sure. And they are among the most generalized caterpillars known on the planet. So something like 700 species of woody plants are known to be hosts for fall webworm all over the world. This is one of the ones we've exported. They're native to North America, but they were introduced into Europe by accident and have been horrible pests in Europe and Asia as well. And they're spreading and continuing to expand their host range. But these are what the individual caterpillars look like. And just like the tent caterpillars, they're central place foragers, and they just expand their web and then feed on the vegetation. Okay, then everybody's favorite, which I just saw a couple of days ago, this past weekend when I was camping with my daughter, I saw my very first instar monarch caterpillar, and this is it right here. An iconic species that turns into the monarch butterfly, this amazing journey that you probably have all heard about. It's known, Danaus plexibus is the scientific name. It's a nymphalid, and it only is found on milkweeds. So if you want to look for monarchs, you have to look on milkweeds. And we have a bunch of species of native milkweeds around here, including common milkweed and butterfly weed and swamp milkweed and four-leaved milkweed. There's a whole lot of different species. We find them in the summer and fall. I usually see the caterpillars more in the late season around here for whatever reason. They're brightly colored, like I mentioned before, and that's because they're sequestering the cardinalides that are in their host plant, that are in this sticky white latex that are pressurized in all the leaves. So in order for this first instar caterpillar to begin to feed on the plants, it has to nick all these laticifers, these little sort of tubes full of latex that lets it drain, and then it goes and feeds elsewhere once the latex is all drained. That's the strategy, because all this gooey latex can gum up the mandibles of this little tiny caterpillar. So it has special behaviors for circumventing the plant defenses, which is really interesting. And you can see I did include the pupa of this one because it's so beautiful. It has this gold flecking in the chrysalis, because this is a butterfly. Okay, another common butterfly that we found, another common butterfly we find around here is the red-spotted purple. I've seen them in the woods a lot. Limonitis, commonly feeds on willows and cherries and birch. And these are really cool caterpillars. They look like bird poop mimics when they're little. And they do this crazy thing where they feed upon the end of a leaf, but they preserve the mid vein of the leaf. So they eat the tissue around the vein. And then they do something interesting with their frass. So they use their little frass pellets, they mix it with silk, and they build one by one this little gangplank made out of frass that they sit on. And the idea is ants and other kinds of predators, they can't navigate this very well. So they're basically sitting out on the gangplank when they're not feeding, and then they'll go and feed for a little bit and then return to the gangplank. They do something really weird. They develop partway as caterpillars, and then if they haven't finished developing, they build this hibernaculum out of silk. So they, up in the right-hand corner of the screen, you see this little hibernaculum that the caterpillar hangs out in all winter long. Then it hatches, it comes out as it doesn't hatch, it comes out as a mid-instar caterpillar later on in the following spring, and then switches its motif completely to look like this. You can see it's all glistening. It's still a bird poop, but it's a much bigger one. It has these horns and things as well. And it turns into our beautiful red spotted purple butterfly. One of the most striking ones is the spice bush swallowtail, and this is similar for our eastern tiger swallowtails. They have, the early instars are really good mimics of bird poop. It looks like a little bird poop lying on a leaf. And that, as they get bigger, you can only be so big and be a bird poop. It shifts over to looking like a snake. So they have so its head is underneath here. This is its thorax, and it's got fake eyes on it. So it looks like these are eyes, but they're not really eyes. They're just a motif to look like a snake. And remember, these are the ones that have the osmeteria that they can stick out as well. And so I always look for these. This is Papilio troilus, the spice bush swallowtail, and it only feeds on plants in the Lauraceae. So spice bush, Lindera benzoin, and our common sassafras are its favorite hosts. And you find those in spring and summer if you're lucky. And they like to hang out on the top of the leaf. So you often see them in a little curl of a leaf is where you'll find these caterpillars. Okay. So then we have skippers, silver spotted skipper, one of the favorite caterpillars I've been working on. I showed you a couple pictures of these already before. They only feed on legumes. Around here, you look for them on black locust, any of the trefoil, desmodium, wisteria, they introduce kudzu, American hog peanut. These are all legumes around here, and they build these really cool shelters on these leaves. There's a couple generations locally, so this is a prime time to be looking for these guys right now. And their shelter building is one of the things that distinguishes them. So I'm going to try to show a little video here. Hopefully this is going to work. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Okay, I hope you like that. My colleague Martha Weiss at Georgetown made that video. So you can see how they build their shelters. Okay, so moving on, we have the iconic pipevine swallowtail. So if you grow pipevine aristolochia in your yard for its beautiful flowers, then you'll often attract this native butterfly. They also feed in groups, so they lay their eggs in batches, and you see these gorgeous tentacles-looking caterpillars that feed on pipevine swallowtail. On pipevine, and they're found in the summer. Okay. These are all sort of big, sexy ones I've shown you, but most caterpillars are a little bit more cryptic and smaller. So I want to just give a shout out to the leaf miners. So there are many species of leaf mining caterpillars in a whole bunch of different families, about a dozen families of Lepidoptera that are really primitive. The larvae are found tunneling their way through the leaf, the surface of the leaf. So they're in between the two sides of the leaf making these little tunnels. You've probably seen them on your vegetation. And most plants have leaf miners. So especially a lot of the broadleaf trees have many, many species of leaf miners. And I listed a bunch of different host plants that are good ones to look on, including holly, because there's a holly leaf miner that's super common. And they're found throughout the summer and fall. And you can see the caterpillar here inside of its mine. Some of the mines are on the top, some are on the bottom, some are on both sides. Some of them are serpentine, some of them are blotches. And so they're very diagnostic, and there's a lot of information on the leaf mines. If you know the plant, then odds are you can figure out who the miners are, because they tend to be very specific to different host plants. Okay, my wife asked me to put this one in because it's one of her favorites. So we refer to this guy as the electric mouse caterpillar, kind of commonly, but it's known as the wavy line flannel moth caterpillar, Megalopyge crispata. Here are the eggs, here are the early instars. They're these furry white fluffs that hardly look like caterpillars. And then the last instar, they morph into this crazy looking tribble-like thing from Star Trek that it crawls around and is defended with stinging hairs. So this is definitely one that stings, so you want to be careful. It's found in late summer, fall. So they're probably just getting going right now. I haven't seen any yet, but I expect to see some pretty soon. I found this one this summer, which I thought was exciting. This is the pawpaw sphinx. So these are the sphingids, or what we call the horntails, because they have this large protuberance at the end of their abdomen. This includes the tobacco hornworms as well, but this one is on pawpaw. So it's a specialist only on pawpaw, Dolba hyloius. And it's only found in the summer, the early, the mid, and the gorgeous late instar. And if you look at this up close, you can see all the prolegs and the spiracles and these colorful legs. Really beautiful insect. Okay, another group of caterpillars that is a little bit more cryptic, but if you do a little sleuthing, you can tend to find. I mentioned before that so many different species build shelters. The leaf tires, especially on oaks and hickories, if you open them up this time of year, there are many, many of these shelters. You open them up and you're bound to find these cool, interesting little caterpillars that are making a little house in between the two leaf surfaces. So they silk it together, build these little chambers. They mix their frass in with silk to build walls. They have little rooms that they occupy, and then they just skeletonize or scrape away at the leaf surface. There's various different species in a whole bunch of different families, and I'll show you a picture of an assortment of them in a second. But oak and beech are the most common species to look for these leaf tires in the summer and throughout the fall. They're among the most abundant caterpillars you can find around here. Here's just a little slide showing all the different species of leaf tires that build and live inside those little leaf ties on oaks. So just on white oak alone, you can find any of these dozen or so different species. Of course, the giant silk moth caterpillars are fan favorites. So things like the hickory horned devil and some of these guys. So I put the early instars and the late instars so you can see what they grow into. Here's Promethea, the hickory horned devil, Cecropia moth, Luna moth caterpillars. These are all beautiful, beautiful, fun things to rear. Rear them again on the host plant that you find them on. And the hickory horned devil, it's the biggest caterpillar in North America. We were lucky enough to find one. Here's it on Diane's arm, and my kids getting to see them. They're the size of a hot dog. They're literally 6 inches long. If you have never felt one crawl on you, it's an interesting experience. Very exciting to find one. I only found a couple in my whole life, so keep your eye out. And of course, they turn into these beautiful adults, right? And if any of you think these are butterflies, you'd be wrong. All 4 of those are moths. Just goes to show you how colorful moths can be. And of course, wouldn't be complete about my favorite group of caterpillars, which many people don't even recognize as caterpillars. They look more like nudibranchs or something in the marine realm, are these crazy, highly modified larvae in the family Limacodidae, known as slug caterpillars. They're not specialized at all. They're generalist feeders on a whole variety of woody plants. So you can look for them on any of the common woody plant species around here. And they're only found in the late summer and fall on deciduous trees. And they come in a broad assortment of very cryptic to very warningly colored. and everything in between. So they're just really beautiful caterpillars, from the monkey slug to the saddleback to the skiff moth and a spiny oak slug. These are all different caterpillar species that you can, these are all local. Every one of these species I found right around town. So keep your eye out. This is one of my award-winning pictures. So this is the saddleback. When they hatch, they lay their eggs in groups. And this is the last instar. And you can see, it's pretty obvious, you don't want to touch this thing. You can see the incredibly defended spines that these guys have that have a pretty nasty venom. You can also see the way they move around. Since they move kind of like slugs, they don't have any prolegs at all. They kind of slither along the leaf surface, secreting this silk that they slide along. So that's why they call them slug caterpillars. They move like slugs and they secrete a kind of a silky slime on the leaf as well. Okay, so I just want to give you guys a little bit of information if you're interested and want to learn more about these caterpillars. There's a whole series of books that my colleague and one of the world's expert on caterpillars, Dr. David Wagner, who's a professor at the University of Connecticut, has published this amazing set of field guides. This is just 2 of them. There are several more for different groups that are in beautifully illustrated pictures of caterpillars and all kinds of information. We just published a new guide specifically just to caterpillars on oaks that includes a lot of the microleps, the small little guys. So that's another resource, and that's also available online as well. So but I want to also mention that for many years, I partnered with my wife, who's an environmental educator, to really bring this menagerie of caterpillars that we find locally into the local classrooms in Maryland, DC, and Virginia. And we've been doing this for many years. This is me and my colleague Martha Weiss and one of our graduate students. And we work with the schools and with Diane, who sets all this up for us through Green Kids, to basically enrich the STEM education of these kids, many of whom, as part of their science curriculum, have raised one species of butterfly in the classroom. But we want to kind of show them all the variety and different types of caterpillars that can be found. And of course, kids are interacting and seeing caterpillars all the time in their environment. So it's really great to bring live caterpillars into the classroom, let them see them really close up, what they do, what they look like, how they behave, and that kind of thing, and use that as a jumping off point to sort of teach them a little bit about insect biology. So it's a really fun and rewarding experience that we've been doing in partnership with ANS for many years. Here's also a whole suite of web resources that are online, from Bug Guide to Moth Photographers Group that has a caterpillars portion. The Maryland Biodiversity Project is growing every day with new great pictures of local caterpillars. There's even a Facebook group where if you want to post pictures of caterpillars to get identified, usually within minutes they get ID'd. So there's a great Facebook group. There's also the Caterpillar Lab, which I didn't include here, which is a website you can go to that has another set of amazing resources, so you can both identify and learn more about these amazing insects, that the little things that rule the world, really. So on that, I thought I'd end with this gorgeous picture of Oligocentria lignicolor, one of our prominent moth caterpillars that blends in so beautifully with the leaves that it feeds on in the fall. And thank you all for attending and supporting ANS through this exciting series that they've put together for all of you that are interested in natural history like me. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
Hi, Dylan. Thank you so much for that captivating talk. It was amazing. And there's quite a few questions in the chat. So let's get started.
Okay.
Frank is asking, I assume their heads contain sense organs, the caterpillars. So what happens when they lose their heads between different installs?
That's a great question. So a lot of people, when they're raising caterpillars, especially kids, are really upset when all of a sudden their head pops off, right? It appears that their head pops off. What's really happening is it's just the outer cuticle of their head that it has to split down the middle, and then it does pop off. And it's just a thin shell. And so their bigger head is already grown underneath of it by the time they pop off their old one, right? So they're not losing their head so much as just, it's just a hardened part, kind of like when a crayfish molts, or any other arthropod or crustacean has to molt. Their skeleton is on the outside, the cuticle, and they just shed that and pull themselves out. And a lot of the caterpillars, it's really interesting, a lot of them actually immediately eat their old molt as soon as they do it. So they'll molt and then they'll immediately consume it. And some people think that maybe they're getting some little bit of nutrients from that. A lot of other people think they're just hiding the evidence, because those molts are a really good signal that there's a caterpillar about, right? So we use those when we find them in the field. We're like, okay, we got to look closer. So do other predators, right? And so we think that one of the main reasons they might be doing that is to hide the evidence that they've just molted, because they're really vulnerable right when they're molting, because they're not feeding and they're not particularly well defended. So as soon as they molt, what they cannot do while they're molting is feed, though. So that's a really good point, because their eye spots, their antennae, and their mandibles are all in their head, right? And so their mandibles, as well as accessory appendages that they use to handle their food. And so sometimes their head capsule gets stuck. And this is an alarming thing for those of us that rear caterpillars. You'll see them walking around with half their head capsules halfway off, but it didn't pop all the way off. And they actually cannot feed while they have that stuck on their head. So sometimes we'll gently pop it off in order to let them go on. Usually in nature, I think they'll dry out enough that they pop off. But every once in a while, they'll starve to death if they can't. It's the only hard part on their body, right? And so the rest of their body is pretty soft and they can shed their cuticle very easily, but the head capsule is the tricky one. And so they do pop it off. And we use the head capsule as a way to measure what instar they're in, because they tend to go in increments. It's sort of like a step function in terms of how big the head capsule continues to grow. So with calipers, you can measure the diameter of the head capsule, and you can do it even after the head capsule's popped off. So we often save them, and then we can measure them so that we'll know when we measure them in the field, we know which instar they're in. So we use that because the rest of the body is like a slinky. It can move and stretch, and so it's really hard to measure how long they are, how wide they are, but you can measure the head capsule. So that's a really, really good question.
That's fascinating. Maureen wanted to know, what is the name of the larva on a beech leaf?
On a beech leaf?
Yeah, related to the slide that you showed us pretty early in the...
Let's see. Let me go back. Can I share again? I can do that.
It was one of the slugs.
Oh, one of the slugs. Yeah. Oh, yeah, yes. I know which one you're talking about. Yes. Yes, that was called Tortricidia. So it's called the button slug, or the red cross button slug. It's almost, there's 3 species that are really closely related, and they're almost impossible to tell apart as larvae. So I never am certain what it is unless we rear it all the way to the moth. But if you look in the field guides, it's called, the common name is the button slug, that looked like the little fungus that was on the beech leaf. Yeah, I remember that one. So good question.
Thank you. And Luz Patricia Hernandez. Hi, Patricia. Do moths and butterflies have silk glands, or is this only a larval feature?
That's a really good question. So as far as I know, silk is only produced in the caterpillar stage. Because remember, caterpillars, like a lot of generalist insects, they have pretty generalized mouth parts. They have a pair of mandibles that are like scissors for cutting into the leaf tissue. But butterflies and moths have a completely different feeding apparatus. They take those mandibles and basically turn them into a long straw, big feeding tube that they can feed on liquid resources like nectar or water. And then some of them don't have mouth parts at all, because as adults, right, adult moths and butterflies don't grow. As soon as they emerge as adults, they're adults. They don't grow at all. And because they don't grow, a lot of them don't even need to feed. Essentially, all they're just all about reproduction, right? They're looking for a mate and laying eggs, and that's their sole job essentially as adults. Now, a lot of butterflies do feed because they feed on sugar water, which is like Gatorade, so that they can keep flying. You know, they're high energy butterflies, and they need to tank up on sugar every once in a while, but they don't feed on the leaf tissue anymore. So there's no need. So the silk glands probably are completely gone by the time they're adults. I don't know of any adults that use silk in any way, but almost all the larvae have silk glands and can produce. It's actually really interesting. It's like a semi-fluid liquid silk, and as soon as it comes out, it hardens immediately, and they can stretch it. They can weave it into things. They can stretch it. It's a protein. It's very strange, and so they can do. It has really bizarre biomechanical properties where most textiles, when they get wet, they actually stretch. But caterpillar silk, when it gets wet, it hyper condenses. It's really weird, like a spring almost. And so when you're trying to pull a leaf together, as you're silking with the strand, you make a silk strand, and as it starts to pull the leaf together, that leaf is still transpiring. So moisture is coming out of the stomata, and it's wetting the silk, and as it gets wetter, it pulls it tighter and tighter and tighter. So that property of the silk actually makes the leaf pull tighter than it otherwise would. It's really amazing. So I figured you'd ask a question like that. So
Thank you. From Rosemary Donaldson, I have raised monarchs in my home and classroom for years.
Right.
However, I have recently been told that if monarchs are raised indoors, even near a window, they will not migrate as butterflies. Can you speak to this? I'm hesitant to continue raising them.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure that there's been a lot of school groups that have raised monarchs and even tagged them and released them. I mean, every once in a while, if you see adult monarchs, you'll see they have tags on their wings. And if you do see one with a tag, you should write it down because there's a code there. And there's a website you can go to and you can record your observation because they track their migration through Journey North and Monarch Watch. There's a whole bunch of different organizations that are involved in tracking monarchs. But yeah, maybe that idea is out there, but I'm pretty sure that they still are capable of continuing the migration. So as far as I know, so I mean, maybe it's not the best idea to do it in the late fall when they're all heading back to Mexico, but if you do it in the middle of the summer, those generations are still either local or moving north. And so I would guess that that would still be okay because you're still supplementing the local population. So if another generation happens, presumably they get all the cues they need in order to properly migrate south. But I'm not an expert on that. So I would defer to those websites, which have really good resources for anybody that wants to rear monarchs. I mean, really the best thing you can do is just grow milkweed, right? That's what everybody should be doing. It's a native plant. It's beautiful. It's got all kinds of interesting insects besides monarchs that feed on it. And you can do your part just by growing it. So we have a whole bunch in our garden and we get monarchs every year. So I encourage people to just grow milkweed is probably the best thing you can do.
Thank you. From Tom Gardner, do they play any role in carbon? What aspect of caterpillar biology / ecology does your own research involve? And yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so they do play a role in carbon because they're processing so much plant material and they release so much frass. The frass that they've consumed that exits out their back end drops to the ground, and it actually releases nutrients back into the soil faster than the normal process of leaf breakdown, because they often sort of disrupt a lot of the chemicals that are hard for fungi and bacteria to decompose. So they've shown with gypsy moth frass, for example, that it actually cycles nitrogen faster into the ecosystem when it's processed through gypsy moth caterpillars. So there is definitely sort of a recycling role that caterpillars play in the carbon cycle. In terms of my own research, I'm mostly focused on species interactions involving plants, caterpillars, and the natural enemies of the caterpillars. So I didn't talk about that, but caterpillars are amazing host to all of these parasitic wasps and flies that use the caterpillar as a host for their own developing young, that if you've ever seen a tobacco hornworm that has white cocoons all over it, that's a braconid wasp that has attacked that caterpillar and used it as a host. It's a little gruesome, but it's incredibly fascinating. And if you combine the plants, the caterpillars, and their parasitoids, that's the lion's share of biodiversity on the planet right there in those 3 trophic levels. And so almost all of my research has focused on the ways in which plants, caterpillars, and these parasitoids interact with one another in different ways. So.
From Catherine Maynard. Hi, Kate. Can we find caterpillars on tree saplings or more often on mature trees?
Both. So definitely on saplings. I mean, you want to maximize your chance. I mean, they're not super high density all the time. So I prefer to look in low branches of understory trees, so that are a little bit decent size, because then you can inspect a lot of leaves. They can definitely be on saplings, so you can look there, but you're often sort of limited in how many leaves you can look on a sapling, right? Because they're just not that big. But the types of caterpillars you'll find are going to change through the season. That's why I was trying to indicate when to look for the different species. So that's the fun part, is if you want to look for them, you can start as the leaves are just breaking bud, there's a whole set of caterpillars that only feed on the new expanding leaves. And they're only found in the spring. And they have one generation, and then they overwinter all summer, all fall, and they don't come out until the following spring again to repeat the whole cycle again. The highest diversity of caterpillars is actually found in the spring around here. There's more species in the spring than any other time of year. But there's a lot found in the fall. So right now, from now until end of September, is primo caterpillar hunting season. So if you want to get out there and look, visit the state parks and the county parks and look on this low-hanging foliage, and I guarantee you're going to find all kinds of these really great. And as the season goes on, they get bigger, so they're easier to find as well, which is very handy. And of course, the slug caterpillars are only found in the late season. They just started, so keep looking for those all through August and September. I think that's some of the best hunting, other than the early spring. So there's sort of 2 peaks: the early spring and the fall, that I think are the best for finding caterpillars. But you can find them really any time of year. And so again, you want to pay attention to the plants, right? So you really need to learn a few of the common trees, so you know what to feed them and you know what to look for them. And once you learn the plants, then you'll start seeing the caterpillars. And once you see them and the damage that they cause, you'll never look at the plants the same as again. So you sort of lose your plant blindness, and you'll start, the same with the insects, and you'll just start to see them everywhere when you look for them.
Sure. Will monarch caterpillars eat dogbane?
Generally not. So there are some caterpillars that they're in the same family now, actually. There are some caterpillars that feed on both dogbane and milkweed, but generally you only find monarchs on milkweed. A couple of the others cross over between those 2.
Can you tell us the difference between a moth and a butterfly from Beth?
Yes. So give me a second. I have a slide just for that. So where's the end of my talk? So yeah, I am. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So here's a phylogeny of the butterflies and moths. And what you can see is the butterflies are in pink, and they're just nested in the middle of all the moths, right? So really what butterflies are is they're pretty day-flying moths, right? So they're not anything special, really. They're just a special kind of moth that flies during the day and has some special adaptations. But that said, they're all closely related, right? And so one of the easiest ways to tell them apart is to look at their antennae, right? Because they all can be colorful, but the antennae of moths and butterflies are quite different. Almost all butterflies have either what we call club-shaped antennae. So the end of the antenna ends in this thickened club, like here and here. Or in the case of the skippers, which are a form of butterfly, that club has a little hook on it. So you can see their little hook. So the skippers all have a little hook. The butterflies all have clubbed antennae. Then the moths have a variety. they're either just what we call filiform, that just looks like a little thread like antennae, or, and that's usually a female, the males have these plumose antennae most of the time that have big surface area, because the way they mate is the female releases pheromones and just waits, and then the male has these big giant antennae to pick up those chemicals and then fly and find her in order to mate. So if they have either thread-like or feathery antennae, odds are they're a moth. If they have club-like, they're a butterfly, and if they have hooks, they're a skipper. So does that help? And when they fly is a little bit of a hint, but there's lots of butterflies that will sometimes be active at night, and there's a ton of moths that are active during the day as well. Okay, good question.
Thank you. Tom Gardner would like to know, how do the woolly bears and other multi-host species deal with a wide variety of toxins? How and why have they been able to deal with that variety instead of pairing with a particular host of plant?
Yeah, so the woolly bears are I always think of them as kind of like cows, right? So rather than being sort of plant parasites that stay their whole life when they're feeding in the larval stage on a single plant, they just wander around and eat a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And they are pretty generalized in their diets, although when you look carefully at it, a lot of the woolly bears, that group tends to be feeding on plants that have toxins. And so usually what unites the different plants is some of them are nutritious, so they're feeding on just for the protein or the nutrients. And then a few others are toxic. And those toxic ones, they often feed on specifically in order to gather those chemicals and use them in their own defense, or even sometimes in producing pheromones. So they use plant chemicals to make their own pheromones. And those are all turned into tiger moths, which are some of our most beautiful moths, really colorful, showy moths with bright colors. And they're advertising their toxicity by their bright colors. So how they deal with all these different plants is a little bit of a mystery. It's one of the things that I do in my own research, is we raise them on and we change their diet. We give them only one plant, or we give them mixtures of plants, and we measure how quickly or slowly they grow and how well they survive and how big they get. All those kinds of things sort of play into it. And so there's still a lot we don't understand about the foraging decisions that the caterpillars make, especially the woolly bears, because they're among the most mobile of all the caterpillars. One of my favorite stories is one of the common caterpillar in Arizona. It's called Estigmini. It's one of the salt marsh caterpillars or tiger moth caterpillars. This is another kind of woolly bear. And my colleague who studies those has actually shown that when the parasites that we also study, these parasitic flies and wasps, when they lay eggs inside the body of the caterpillar responds by completely changing its host plant preferences and starts feeding voraciously on highly toxic plants that normally it doesn't feed a lot on. It might feed a little bit on, but they'll preferentially feed on it. And what they're actually doing is self-medicating. And those toxins accumulate in their hemolymph, in their blood, and then kill the parasites. So they can actually rid themselves of their parasites by feeding preferentially on toxic plants. And he showed that they actually change their taste receptors to prefer the bitter compounds in these toxic plants only when they've been attacked by the parasites. It's really a great story where the insects are essentially self-medicating when they get parasitized. So the more we learn about them, it's all chemistry. There's so much chemistry that's involved in all these interactions.
Thank you. From Anna Ka'ahanui. Hi, Anna. Is there a hierarchy in caterpillar groups like in bee communities? And are there certain roles?
Generally not. So there are a lot that feed in groups. They're usually all about the same age. So, and they don't really divvy up jobs like they do. I mean, they are some social ones, and there are different levels of sociality in the caterpillars. But most of the group feeding is just they're sort of enhancing their own individual fitness. So they're not like social insects in that regard.
Do caterpillars only live for a year, or is there a range of lifespans?
So most of them don't even live a whole year. So the caterpillar stage is pretty limited, right? So for butterflies, it might only be 10 days, 2 weeks that they're in the caterpillar stage. But obviously they overwinter as something. It could be a caterpillar, it could be an egg, it could be a pupa, or it could be an adult. There's examples in Lepidoptera of all 4 stages being the sort of dormant stage that isn't doing anything over the winter here in the temperate zone, right? Because they have to deal with winter in some way. And so most only really live less than a year, and except that, again, they have to overwinter in some stage. So, you know, whether it's the egg or the pupa or whatever. So there's a couple that require more than 1 season. And in the Arctic, there are caterpillars that can take 12 or 14 years to complete their development because the growing season is so short. They'll feed basically when the light's out, they feed 24 hours a day, but they only make it like 1 and more instar, and then they go into hibernation, and then they come out the next year and grow another instar. And so there's the world records. I think it's like 12 or 14 years before they actually reach the pupal stage, and that's only in really, really cold climates. So around here, it's pretty typically, you know, just 1 season.
That is insane. Beth would like to know what was the name of the fungus on the beech leaf.
Oh, that's a good question. I used to know this. Yeah, maybe you know it, Sarah. It's super common. It's like it's a rust fungus, I think, or something like that.
Yeah.
I'd have to look it up. It's really easy to find, but it's very, very common on all the beech trees around here. So.
Yeah, unfortunately, I do not know that one. Thank you so much for an amazing presentation.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for showing up. I was surprised we had so much interest in caterpillars.
Thank you.